The fog began to lift just after dawn, unrolling from the Atlantic like torn cloth. The ship's deck plates glistened under a sheen of salt, and every cable groaned with the weight of a crossing finally ending. Children and soldiers crowded the rail together, their faces colorless after weeks below deck. Some still wore sand-colored field jackets, stiff from dried seawater. Others had been issued the rough work coats marked P/W, prisoner of war. When the first outline of the American coast appeared a smudge of gray towers above the white hiss of waves, none of them believed it. 12-year-old Karl Meinhardt gripped the railing with both hands. His knuckles bruised white against the metal. He had never seen a city rise straight out of the sea. In England, towns had worn their war like ash. Ports had smelled of ropes, rust, and hunger. Here the air itself seemed strange, heavy, with fuel oil, sugar, and something faintly sweet like baking bread. The ship's engines slowed, sending a deep hum through the floorboards and through his bones. "America," one prisoner whispered, not sure if it was hope or warning. The skyline sharpened. Gray piers jutted into the harbor. Cranes leaned against the dawn, and above them fluttered banners of smoke from unseen trains. Closer, between warehouses, Karl saw color, billboards for soap and cigarettes, painted red and yellow. Beyond the river, sunlight touched glass windows on buildings too tall to count. It looked like fiction, as if no bomb had ever found this side of the world. He expected shouting, command barked through the din, dogs herding them into order. Instead, he heard nothing but the slap of water against steel and the dull rhythm of marching boots softened by distance. U.S. Army guards lined the pier in crisp khaki, quiet, efficient, bored. They didn't spit, didn't jeer. One even waved them forward with two fingers, as if welcoming passengers. Karl's boots hit the gangway, and his entire body shivered at the solidity of land. He smelled coal smoke from locomotives and the faint tang of disinfectant from barrels marked sanitation depth. A Red Cross nurse stood near the gangplank holding 2 tin buckets of apples. Apples. She gestured for each prisoner to take one. Her expression never changed, but her hand trembled a little with the gesture. The fruit skin was cold and wax smooth, too perfect to eat. Karl slipped it into his coat pocket like contraband from another planet. The pier was swept clean. On it waited rows of green coaches, windows polished, air already thick with the smell of burned diesel. Painted stencils read, U.S. Army Transportation Corps, POW car inside. Straw mattresses had been laid side by side. Canteens full of water at every seat. Blankets rolled precisely. Karl followed a sergeant's hand signal and climbed aboard, still expecting the moment when kindness turned trap. As the train began its slow westward cut, soldiers walked the aisles without rifles drawn. They handed out paper cups of coffee, real coffee, sweet and steaming. Karl's first sip scalded his tongue, and he winced. The guard grinned and shrugged, as if to say, better hot than gone. Through the window, the enormity of America unspooled. Docks giving way to factories, factories giving way to fields so wide they seemed to tilt the world. No bomb craters, no smoke, only movement and order. Expectation, retribution, chains, and hollow stomachs. Reversal, clean blankets, apples, and silence disciplined by mercy. That night the train clattered through the Pennsylvania hills. Lights flickered over snow-covered farms where barns stood unscarred and cows slept in neat rows. Karl pressed his forehead to the glass until it fogged, trying to imagine anyone bombing something so peaceful. When fatigue won, he fell asleep clutching the apple still hidden in his pocket. It smelled faintly of sugar and soil and home. Across the United States in 1944 and 1945, the landscape of war was measured not in battlefields, but in fences. Small towns that had once known only harvest or factory shifts now held thousands of captured men from campaigns as far away as North Africa and Normandy. For many Americans, it was the first physical sign of the world beyond their borders. For the captured soldiers, it was the first glimpse of civilization untouched by ruins. Among them were a handful of boys' farmhands pressed into uniforms before their voices had deepened, auxiliaries swept up when Germany's ranks collapsed. They stepped off the trains bewildered, still smelling of salt, carrying neither weapons nor certainty. The U.S. Army had prepared with typical precision 450,000 prisoners scattered through more than 500 camps from Mississippi cotton fields to the foothills of Wyoming. Each facility copied the same pattern: wooden barracks lined in quadrangles, guard towers at every corner, and a whitewashed chapel or canteen near the center. The system ran on rules thicker than any rifle barrel. The Geneva Convention enforced capacity, calories, schooling, and leisure. It wasn't charity, but principle. America wanted to prove that democracy could discipline itself even when the enemy could not. Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp McCain in Mississippi, Camp Hearn in Texas, each followed the same heartbeat: reveille at dawn, work details at 8, evening assemblies under the floodlights. Most men were strong enough for labor cotton harvests, road maintenance, sawmill crews. For the convalescents, the older and the too young, work turned into classes, reading circles, and endless waiting. They called this invisible population Die Stillen. The quiet ones, Karl Meinhardt, arrived among them. At 12 years old, he was too frail to work, too shy to rebel, too young to have the swagger that war had printed on others. He became a ward of the camp hospital, odd job helper to medics, who tolerated his silence because he moved quickly and smiled when spoken to. The rules of captivity were both firm and strange. Prisoners addressed guards as "Sir," and saluted the flag each morning out of respect rather than submission. In return, they were paid in coupons redeemable for cigarettes, chocolate bars, and stationery. Mail traveled through sensors like bottled messages to another planet, 5 lines of script that might take months to crawl across the Atlantic. Punishment usually meant loss of privileges, not rations. Letters from Kansas mothers sometimes arrived containing knitted gloves or photographs signed to a German boy. "My son is somewhere in yours." Local curiosity softened hostility faster than any directive. Children from nearby farms climbed fences to trade candy for buttons. Shopkeepers in Emporia and Salina noticed how the prisoners stared into store windows, not for escape routes, but for novelty light bulbs, radios, oranges piled in pyramids. Once or twice, civic leaders invited camp orchestras to play Sunday concerts through the wire for townsfolk who stood outside listening. To everyone's surprise, the music sounded familiar. Mozart, Strauss, an American march learned from their guards. The crowd applauded and returned the next weekend. For Karl, the first weeks were overwhelming. He had spent his life in bomb shelters and ration lines. Even discipline that promised safety felt alien. He watched the guards cut grass with motorized mowers, machines he had never seen. When they handed him a glass of milk still cold enough to sweat, he drank too fast and coughed it back up. The white liquid on his sleeve looked like purity itself, wasted. Later he helped sweep the barracks, tracing his palm along the smooth pine walls that carried the clean smell of resin, a scent of order, not fear. This reversal wasn't universal. Some prisoners worried that softness dulled vigilance. Others, steeped in propaganda, mistrusted politeness as deliberate deception. Yet, day by day, America refused to produce villains. Complaints sent to command often amounted to boredom, not brutality. In Geneva reports, inspectors wrote that morale in U.S. compounds was paradoxically high, explaining that constant predictability proved more exhausting to hatred than isolation ever could. Stillness carried a different weight for the youngest. Deprived of adult certainty, they absorbed new behaviors by mimicry, standing for the anthem, crouching to stroke stray dogs that slipped under the fence, repeating the easy slang they caught from GIs. "Okay? Coffee good?" and laughing when the meaning finally clicked for Carl. It was education disguised as captivity. Every morning the bugle meant nothing military at all, just breakfast, warmth, and another day of quiet stability. Winter 1944 gave way to Kansas spring, a slow thaw of snow into black mud. By day, a mirror of the sun, by night, a glaze of ice again. For weeks the prairie winds carried two alternating scents: fertilizer from distant farms and grain coffee drifting from the camp kitchens. Inside that world of routine, 12-year-old Carl Meinhardt began to test what enemy actually meant. He was assigned to light duties, sweeping the hospital ward, fetching supplies, feeding chickens that pecked along the wire fence. The nurses, mostly Army volunteers, soon learned the rhythm of his shy good humor. One day, an American corporal named Sam Harper found him standing transfixed by a broom, turning it over carefully, marveling at the polished handle. "Back home, we got factories making 100 of those a day," Harper said, half smiling. Carl understood nothing but the tone. The guard mimed brushing motion, and Carl burst out laughing, not at the joke but at the absurdity of being taught sweeping by a man with a rifle. It was the first sound of genuine laughter to cut through the ward that month. Meals came on enamel trays, meatloaf, white bread, and fruit cocktail so sweet it made his gums ache. He wrote about it in a letter to his mother through the Red Cross form card limited to 25 words. Healthy food good. American strange but kind. Dream of milk. He would later learn she never received it. Hamburg's mail center stood in ashes. But the simple act of writing, under no threat, already felt like proof the world had not ended. If the guards noticed their effect, they never spoke of it. Their job was structure work, count, lights out. Yet small accidents reshaped everything. Carl dropped a tray of dishes once during inspection. When he flinched, expecting punishment, the American sergeant knelt instead, helped him gather the pieces, and said, "Just dishes. Nobody shot for that here." Something inside the boy cracked more permanently than the porcelain. After that he began to hum while he worked, tunes from a childhood in Cologne, drowned by sirens now returned as faint melodies beneath the hiss of boilers. Sunday afternoons brought the loudest paradox of all: freedom scheduled. Thin wires of music drifted from a barrack where prisoners strummed guitars fashioned from scrap. In the yard, Americans and Germans played improvised soccer barefoot, laughing, even wagering cigarettes on goals. Carl could not join. He was too small, but he learned American cheers anyway, mispronouncing each syllable until both sides teased him affectionately. "Attaboy, Carl," they'd shout when he retrieved the ball from under guard trucks. To a child who had known only uniformed men barking orders, the sound of his name, spoken with warmth, was miracle enough. Later came a quiet turning point disguised as accident. A local farm family near the camp lost a team of hands to the front lines, and the colonel approved a new work detail P/W farm program number 34. Carl, though technically too young, was sent as interpreter for a small group hauling hay under supervision. They rode past the fence in the back of a quarter-ton truck as townspeople watched curiously, some wary, some waving. At midday, the farmer's wife brought them lemonade, handing plastic cups one by one. She stopped at Carl last, offering an extra cookie meant for her own son overseas. He accepted it with stiff fingers, trying and failing to hide tears so hot they startled even him. She said softly, "Eat, child. You're someone's boy." He didn't understand the words, but never forgot the tone. When they returned to camp that night, even the older prisoners noticed his dazed expression. "What did they do to you out there?" one joked. Carl simply held up the cookie tin, showing the crude American heart printed on the tin's lid. "They gave me this," he said quietly, half German, half English. For days he guarded the empty container as if it were armor. The camp itself changed subtly with the seasons. After Germany's surrender, new arrivals poured in from Europe, defeated men who expected revenge, and found baseball games instead of punishments. Some refused to believe it. Others melted into gratitude almost shameful to display. The Americans sensed this disbelief more keenly among the youngest. They treated the boys differently, like students, not soldiers. By August, the chaplain organized English lessons in the old rec hall. Carl sat beside men twice his size, mouthing sounds that felt impossible. "Th," the teacher demonstrated. Carl practiced against his sleeve until he could whisper, "Thank you," and be understood. He learned faster than expected. Guards greeted him across the yard. Townsfolk brought him pencils, a new pair of shoes, even a comic book whose bright colors stunned him. Inside its panels, cowboys galloped through endless yellow plains, the same plains now rising just beyond the fence. It occurred to him that perhaps peace wasn't something handed down by governments. Maybe it was simply what humans decided to live with when nobody interrupted expectation. A child prisoner, terrified of captors. Reversal. A child slowly adopting their gestures until he no longer remembered where fear ever fit. Each small courtesy, a smile, a word, a cookie, became a cleat gripping firm ground after years of mud and noise. One by one, the older men began calling him Unser Amerikaner kind, our American child. He laughed, embarrassed, but secretly thought the name sounded true. Autumn came back to Kansas with long shadows and cinnamon-colored air. Leaves from the cottonwoods along the riverbank cartwheeled across the compound before settling against the wire. Inside the camp, trucks idled in neat rows, mufflers popping softly like the last heartbeats of summer. The notice board outside the command post held 2 new sheets of paper typed in carbon ink. Repatriation lists. The war was over, and Germany's sons 6,000 miles from home were finally going back. Karl Meinhardt found his name on the second sheet, printed unevenly near the bottom. Transport Group 3, Hamburg District. He stared at the letters for a long time, half proud that he could now read them quickly and half wishing he could not. He was 15, still a prisoner, yet already free in ways the boy who'd boarded that troop ship 3 years earlier could never have imagined. In the days before departure, the camp slowed into reflective rhythm. The guards let the prisoners roam across the yard after evening roll call, trusting them now as men rather than quotas. Through open windows came the sound of harmonicas and laughter, mixed with Midwest cicadas. Carl joined his English class one last time. The teacher, a corporal from Ohio, wrote 8 words on the blackboard. "You will always remember your first day in America." The men nodded politely, unsure what he meant. Carl understood perfectly. On the morning of transport, mist hung low over the fields. Lined up by the gate, the uniformed boys who had aged into men stood with duffel bags of souvenirs, handmade toys, sketched portraits, a few pressed flowers from local girls. The commandant came down the row shaking hands. When Carl's turn came, the man removed his cap and said, "You've grown tall, son." It was the sort of remark any father might make, but in that moment it carried the weight of 2 nations trying to stand up again. A guard pressed something small into Carl's palm, a smooth red apple, much like the one he'd taken from the dock years before. No one said the word goodbye. They only nodded and loaded onto waiting trucks. The convoy rumbled east through the wheat belt under a sunrise the color of brass. Towns passed, Topeka, St. Louis, Pittsburgh. At every crossing, people stopped to watch the line of vehicles marked P/W Transport. Some waved, a few saluted. At the docks in New York Harbor, ships waited with decks stripped clean for passengers. Before boarding, Army photographers took identification pictures. When the flashbulb burst in white light, Carl blinked fiercely and for the first time raised his chin straight to the camera without fear. Home was harder. Hamburg had become a skeleton of red brick and broken glass. The air smelled of soot and absence. His mother met him at a displaced person center, with eyes older than her years. When she asked about America, Carl handed her his few treasures, an English primer, his name tag, and the now faded apple. He said in German accented by English vowels, "They fed us, they forgave us, from the first day." She nodded silently, not believing, yet unwilling to doubt the conviction on his face. Over the following years, Carl carried that invisible justice with him. It colored his choices, the civility in how he spoke, the patience in how he waited. When rebuilding efforts reached Hamburg, he learned carpentry from an American engineer and helped reconstruct schools. On the wall of his first classroom workshop, he painted a simple phrase he'd memorized from a nurse's badge: "Service is strength." Decades later, journalists interviewing former German POWs in America would recall the same astonishment. Prisoners treated not as enemies, but as men well-fed, well-guarded, yet invited to regain dignity through order and fairness. Carl's story fit among theirs, but remained uniquely childlike in wonder. He once wrote in a local paper, "How do you thank kindness that arrived on the same train as captivity?" No one could answer. Perhaps that was the point. Back across the ocean, the camp buildings at Phillips and Concordia gradually disappeared, sold as timber, swallowed by grain fields. Only photographs of young men posing beside chalk-ball goals and water towers remained. If anyone looked closely at those prints, they might spot a thin boy standing along the fence, smiling directly at the lens, apple in hand, seeing the small good in a ruined century. America had captured its enemies by force, but it kept them by civility. And for one German child, the first day of captivity became the first day of peace.